Yes.
Hey, this is Lauren calling from Fatherly. How are you?
I'm all right. How you doing?
I'm good. Is that still a good time?
Yes, it is.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for talking to me. I haven't watched the movie yet, but I'm going to watch it over the weekend. So, I'm more just like, I did some reporting on this topic a while ago, and I found it, like, super interesting, and I'm just kind of interested in, like, what your experience was like making the movie, and what that whole journey was like. But, just to start off, what kind of brought you to the topic? What made you decide to make a movie about it? How did you sort of find yourself in this position?
So, I've been doing filmmaking all my life, and when I ran across this topic, it struck me that this affects every man, every partner of a man, every parent and child in the most personal way possible, and yet we don't talk about it. It hits all our cultural taboos around sex and religion and politics, and it's in the most personal way possible. So I felt like, based on the information I was learning about it, that I had a duty to share that information with the world. And like I said, I've been making films since I was 14. I went to film school. It's what I love doing. It's what I've wanted to do all my life. And so that seemed like the natural way to approach the topic.
And how did you come across, like, the information? Was it just from, like, word of mouth and being, like, a man? Or, because, I mean, I guess as a woman, I didn't really realize how emotional of a thing it was.
It's hugely emotional. I mean, that is something that I have found with myself and with everyone I've talked to about it. And it's not just how do you find out about it, but how do you not find out about it? Looking back across my life, there's been times this topic has come up, and I always thought, well, there's nothing I can do about that now, so why think about it? And it made me uncomfortable because every other area of my life, I went through a period where I was letting go of a lot of old patterns that didn't serve me. I was changing a lot of my beliefs. I was changing the way that I ate and the way that I treated other people. And when I ran across this topic, since I felt like there was nothing I could do about it, and so I just sort of thought, out of sight, out of mind. And later, I ran across, when I actually did take the time to search and look things up about it, one of the first things I found was something called foreskin restoration, which is where men stretch the remaining skin of the foreskin and over time get a covering of that part of the body again. And so I thought, well, there is something that you can do about it. It's not a complete reversal, but it's something. And I'd always been told, there's nothing you can do about it. So then that raised the question, what else have I been told that's incorrect?
And then I guess, did you, I know you went through, most people go through their whole lives, knowing that some people are circumcised and some people are not circumcised. And it's not, totally talked about that much culturally. But was there a point where it just sort of, clicked where you're like, this doesn't seem fair, this seems like an injustice that you can remember? Or was it something that was always on your mind?
The piece of information that really struck me was when I learned that up until the mid-1980s, doctors believed that newborn infants did not feel pain and would do the procedure without any anesthesia. And I'm very familiar with how early life trauma impacts people later in life, and so that was really shocking. And many activists have told me that seeing the procedure for the first time is what made them become activists. Seeing a child screaming in pain.
Yeah, no, definitely. When did that, happen? Do you consider yourself an activist, and when did that sort of happen for you?
So I just consider myself a filmmaker. I feel like my role on this issue is to create dialogue, not be an ideologue in any way. And I think that happened in my early 20s. So it took 6 years to make the film, which is been a bit of a process, but that's when it began.
Let's talk about the film. So what has the process been like? And how have things changed over the past 6 years in making it around the issue?
So we interview every major expert on both sides of the debate in the film. We have people from the intactivist movement. We also have people from the American Academy of Pediatrics. We have people who were involved in the HIV studies done in Africa. And one of the things that I have noticed over the course of making the film is just how much the debate has shifted. When I began working on the film, and I would tell people that I was working on this film, they would say, oh, isn't that cleaner or something? And now, when I talk to people about the issue of circumcision, they say, oh, that's really controversial. I've seen a lot of people protesting that. So just in the course of making the film, I think the debate has shifted from a frame of sort of the what now even the American Academy of Pediatrics acknowledges as myths, to a question of whose body, whose rights. Who has the right to make decisions about men's bodies? Does the man have the right to make his own decisions about his body, or do parents have the right to make decisions for them?
I'm sorry, what did you say that the American Academy of Pediatrics has acknowledged?
So when I interviewed a Jewish member of the American Academy of Pediatrics' latest policy statement on circumcision, what he told me on camera, and it's in the film, was that intactivists are now at the center of this debate. That ethical question of who has the right to make decisions about men's bodies is the center of this debate. And that shifted, because if you look at the AAP policy statements from the 80s, they are glowingly positive about circumcision. And now there are members of the committee who acknowledge that these ethical questions are legitimate and worth discussing.
That makes sense. So it's not so much that like the AAP is necessarily, their stance is still like it's up to the parents, but instead of it being like, is this cleaner or not, is this ethical or not, is the conversation.
Yes.
That totally makes sense. I agree with that totally. Definitely noticed that. Have you noticed like extremism on both sides, or is there like I guess I feel like at least the intactivist movement, there's moderate people I've talked to on there, but there are a lot of like I at least heard a lot about just like death threats to like nurses and doctors and that sort of thing. Did you run into any of that?
I haven't seen anything from the intactivist movement that I haven't seen from other major social justice movements. I think when people feel wronged, they often respond to that with anger. And whether or not you think that anger is justified depends on your perspective on circumcision.
That makes sense. And then I guess back to like the research and stuff. What did you find about like the public health side of the argument from your interviews, and what sort of came out of that?
Again, the member of the American Academy of Pediatrics I spoke to acknowledges that the health claims are not compelling, that it is largely a cultural or religious practice. In terms of the specific health claims, it would take at least a 2-hour documentary to go through them all one by one. And that's part of the challenge with this issue, is that to actually delve into the studies around a particular claim requires a lot of time and scientific knowledge, and isn't really relevant if you're asking the question, whose body, whose rights? When we talk about female circumcision in women's bodies, we don't ask, well, what are the health benefits and risks? We acknowledge that women have the right to their own bodies, and that even if there were benefits, the harm of violating that woman's bodily autonomy would trump those.
And then so, I guess, is it accurate? So, my understanding is the argument is, in fact, that there's no health benefit. It's that it's just so slight, it's not significant enough. Is that true?
So the focus of activists is on the human rights aspect and on the bodily autonomy aspect. However, they would argue that the studies that have been done on this are often really poor. For example, the largest claim right now is around circumcision and HIV, that circumcision reduces the rate of HIV. When I interviewed the authors of one of those studies, one of the things that they acknowledge is that circumcised men use condoms at a higher rate than the intact men in their studies. Which means that those studies aren't really HIV studies or circumcision studies, they're condom studies. And when you get into the research of almost all of these claims, they fall apart under similar scrutiny.
True. And I was curious, do we know anything about why uncircumcised men don't wear condoms as much, or is that just like a whole other thing in itself?
So, those studies were in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, and so I couldn't speak to that because I don't know enough about that culture.
But you know that they didn't control for condom use in that study?
No.
Huh. Interesting. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Like you're saying that they're not the movement isn't trying to really they're not impressed by the studies, but they're not necessarily trying to debunk them. They're more not trying to make the issue about the human rights violation. Correct?
Right. I mean, there are studies suggesting that female circumcision reduces the rate of HIV, but no one on any side of the debate thinks those claims are worth even exploring.
No, and that's fair. And then I guess this is another sort of, I think, difficult part of the activist movement, but the sort of, do you, I guess, think are there differences between male circumcision and female circumcision, in your opinion?
That is hard to quantify because there are different types of female circumcision. But I will say that the circumcised women I interviewed for the film say there is no difference.
And, because, I guess, I've heard the arguments that there are different types of female circumcision, and there's, even, a nick, to the clitoris could be considered female circumcision as opposed to fully removing it. But in terms of just, apples to apples, do you think that fully removing a clitoris is the same as removing foreskin? Because I feel like that's a hard part of the argument that, not everyone agrees on.
Not everyone agrees on that because not everyone agrees on the value of the foreskin. So I think when people push back on that claim, they're assuming that the foreskin isn't 15 square inches of skin or the most erogenous part of a man's body, or that it contains thousands of nerve endings. Their assumption is that it's, quote, just a flap of skin. So it's hard to have that discussion without first having a discussion about the value of the foreskin and what that part of anatomy actually is.
And, tell me more about that. I mean, I've heard that but, is that the core of this? Is that men are being sort of robbed of this sexual experience later in life as babies? Is it about pain? Is it about both?
I think the anti-activist movement's arguments are primarily three things. One, it's a violation of someone's human rights to remove a part of their body without their consent. Two, the foreskin, the part being removed, has value in sexuality, and that is an experience that many men want and should be allowed to have. And three, the procedure itself is traumatic and painful and harms the infant in the moment it occurs, and it harms the man he becomes in terms of what emotions he might have about that experience.
And I guess what I'm wondering is, how do you guys, through the third thing is because, I feel like there are men who are circumcised who feel that way, but there are plenty of men who don't feel that way. So, I off, or that like every man that's uncircumcised is, or every man that's circumcised is this way.
So there are circumcised women who say that they're perfectly happy with their experience and they get just as much pleasure as an intact woman would. And we actually interview one of those women in the film. And if you were to go to cultures that practice female circumcision, the majority of women there would say the same thing. People tend to have a bias towards what their experience is and don't want to consider the possibility that there might have been more. And so there are studies that suggest that men who know more about circumcision are more likely to be dissatisfied with it. And I think if you were to interview men who say, I'm fine, I didn't lose anything, they probably don't know a lot about the subject.
Yeah. So it's more of a like ignorance is bliss thing than it not being an actual problem.
Yes, I mean, Americans don't get a lot of sexual education in general, and even less on this subject.
So yeah, I guess that's a good transition into why, like, if this is so wrong, why hasn't it changed from what you can tell, from just all the interviews you've done? Like, well, I mean, because it's not like everyone has, because less people are circumcising their kids, so it seems like what the activism is working, but I mean, what is the end goal to make it, like, illegal, like, or, like, because right now it is the parent's choice, so what, I guess what's the goal of the activist movement if no one's being forced to circumcise their kids?
I think different people in the intactivist movement would answer that differently. There are certainly people who are working towards age restricting the practice to adults, for example, in Iceland and Denmark. And there are others who simply want to change the way that America thinks about circumcision. And the cultures that practice female circumcision are still having the same problems. Even that practice, which in the West we all agree is terrible and should stop, there's still a challenge in terms of changing people's minds and overcoming the cognitive dissonance of, you know, all the bias that this is what happened to my body or this is what I did to my kids and all of those things. So I think that the change that is happening is largely due to greater access to information and greater willingness of people to question their culture and think for themselves.
Nothing really wrong. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, but I just, yeah, like, I don't think, you know, circumcision going, I don't see it becoming illegal. So it's like, if parents can decide, then, I mean, if education is just the goal, that's, like, fine. But, and I don't know, I mean, I also have a real, like, I think the argument, in my opinion, that male circumcision and female circumcision are the same kind of hurts the movement in some ways, because I do think that that's a pretty far leap. But, I mean, that's just a matter of personal opinion. But, because, like, a lot of the things that you're saying, I mean, I've heard from from activists in the movement, and I understand what you're saying, but it does seem like an oversimplification of what female circumcision is.
I mean, the circumcised women who appear in my film, who I've interviewed, would disagree with you. They would say that pain is pain regardless of the gender.
Mm-hmm. And so, do you think, just based on your work with the documentary, that men who are circumcised as babies, what does that look like emotionally as adults? Are they, because I've also heard the argument that circumcision makes men more violent, which I can't get behind that either.
So, among the men who I've interviewed for my film, what I hear from them is a lot of grief. It is the grief that anyone would have if they learned that they had lost a part of their body. If you were to remove any other part of someone's body, they would have a grieving process around that. And I think that for the men in the intactivist movement, that grief is amplified by the larger culture's unwillingness to acknowledge their emotions and see them as valid. Because if you don't want to question circumcision, then you have to invalidate the emotions of people who are.
I mean, but doesn't that invalidate the feelings of everyone who doesn't feel that way? I mean, it's just, is it possible that this is a case-by-case feeling, you know? Or do you think,
So,
or is that too easy?
I don't know that I would ever want to tell someone else how they should feel. And again, you're asking me about the movement. There's a range of perspectives within the movement. I'll say that the goal with my film is to simply present people with information and allow them to come to their own conclusions. So in the film, we don't make any statement as to what the audience should believe. We simply present interviews with people of a range of perspectives and let them come to their own conclusion. And I think that there are even people in the intactivist movement who would say, however you want to feel about it is fine. Your feelings are your feelings. But you have to acknowledge that some men are going to feel grief around this, and that we should spare them that by respecting their human rights when they're a child.
And, okay, so, I guess, so to sort of, does that mean that the sort of grief that men who have already been circumcised who are adults, that I guess generally, just the way they're choosing to deal with that is to speak out and make sure, other children have a choice that they didn't have. Is that fair to say?
There's a lot of that, yeah. I think when people suffer something they feel is traumatic, they want to make sure that others don't go through the same experience. It's a very compassionate and healthy response.
And it's not enough to just decide that they themselves aren't going to circumcise their kids.
That's not really how people respond to human rights violations. To just say, well, I won't commit human rights violations. I think if someone sees something as a human rights violation, then they want to deal with it like they would any other human rights violation.
And do you believe that this is a human rights violation, personally?
I'm not really interested in telling people what to think. I think that before you can even have a conversation about that, you have to understand the issue, understand what circumcision is, understand what the foreskin is, and hear the perspectives that are currently speaking on it. So the goal with my film is just to allow people to hear those perspectives and come to their own conclusion. And I feel like if I was to tell people this is what the truth is, or this is the perspective you should hold, that would end the conversation rather than start one.
And I mean, I guess, I'll tell you my personal views. I'm not pro circumcision. I don't think I don't have a son, but if I had one, I don't think I would do it. But I am not totally convinced it's a human rights violation, but I'm not sure. I'm trying to keep an open mind on that. But I guess I want to ask, because you said it took 6 years. Were there any challenges that came up along the way before? Well, I still have you. That you can speak to. Was there anything that made this topic particularly difficult?
I feel like the biggest challenge was just how to compile all the information there is around this topic into one film. So I had 100 hours of footage and a lot of different topics within this. And I think the biggest challenge was just figuring out how to put that all into one film. And I think we managed to do that. This is a film that covers the sexuality, the medical claims, the history, the modern debate, every aspect about circumcision you might have wanted to know but been afraid to ask.
up, I mean, when it's all said and done, I think the like core of this argument is like, is this a human rights issue? Is this, you know, on the level of like racism or, you know, any sort of social movement? And I guess the impression I'm getting from talking to you is that it is, at least from the information that you're presenting in your documentary. Is that accurate?
I would say that that's where the debate around circumcision is right now. Not just in my film, but in the wider culture and in the world.
So it's not about whether or not to just do it to your kid, it's whether is this right or wrong on a human level.
Yes, and one thing I want to add to that point is that if you make a decision on this issue, your child may come back to you later and have a different perspective on it. And I think when people think about this as a parenting decision, they don't realize that it's something that could impact their relationship with their child, like any other parenting decision would. And so the culture is moving towards that question and that debate. And one thing I think people should think about is where this issue and this discussion is going to be 18 years from now. When, I mean, just in the 6 years I've been working on the film, it has moved from a topic that most people have not heard about to one that they're considering banning in countries like Iceland and Denmark. So this is something that is only going to grow in the coming years.
But don't you think is banning a human rights issue in itself too, because it's a religious thing? I mean, it feels like it's just like one thing or the other. Like it's just, you know what I mean? Like, and that's why it's a choice, because like some people it is a matter of a religious preference. So wouldn't outlawing that be a violation of their rights?
The Jewish activists I've spoken to have all said that they had the right to their own bodies, regardless of what their parents' beliefs were, and that their religious freedom was violated when someone carved a religious symbol into their body without their consent. And I think that the argument that people who are pushing for an age restriction on circumcision in Iceland and Denmark would make is that they have laws against female genital cutting, and yet we don't ask, are those laws Islamophobic and going against people who feel that their religious practice involves cutting women? We understand that the rights of the child trump the parent's religious belief, and that they would make the same argument towards people who say that they have a religious right to cut their son's genitals.
And then I want to just real quick, because I don't want it to get glossed over, but like the idea that circumcising a boy when he's an infant will make him more violent as an adult. I know you were talking about Greece before, but I feel like have you heard that argument specifically?
It doesn't really come up in our documentary, and it is not something that most of the activists I've talked to have brought up.
But has it come up, is what I'm asking.
I've heard it from some people, and there is research that early life trauma affects people later in life, but it's also very hard to draw a one-to-one correlation between something in early life and later in life. So I can't really speak to that because it's not really a focus in our film.
Yeah, because like I do think that there's like definitely a part of the activist movement that is sort of trying to connect circumcision to violence and sexual assault, and I think that really hurts the movement, in my opinion. And I've heard it come up several times in reporting other stories. So I was curious if you heard that, because again, you're trying to, you've heard that and you said you didn't include it in the movie, which is your choice, but you're trying to present, and like you said, you're trying, like, both sides here, and I'm wondering what that side is sort of about.
So what I have heard is that many activists say that circumcision, touching a child's genitals, without his consent fits existing legal definitions for sexual assault. Because in order to do circumcision, you have to forcibly penetrate the space between the glands and the foreskin. And that actually fits existing legal definitions for sexual assault.
And like, so theoretically, do you think that that's maybe where people are getting the idea that boys who are assaulted in that way might be more prone to assaulting people later when they grow up without them realizing it? I'm not asking if you agree, but is that maybe where that comes from?
What you're describing is the idea that early childhood trauma or early abuse makes people more likely to be abusers later. And that's not really something we cover in the film, but it is something that a lot of mainstream psychologists would suggest is the case. Now, does that apply to circumcision? I don't know. I don't have research on that in particular, but I believe that's what you're referencing.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's like an important, because, yeah, again, I'm not especially pro-circumcision, and I don't think that, like, but I do think that there are a number of flaws I've encountered in the activist movement that I think definitely hurt their cause, and that's one of them. I guess, just to sort of wrap things up, I guess for someone, what's in just your opinion, someone who's sort of on the fence about this as a parent, or maybe even they're divided in sort of their relationship between a mother and father about what to decide to do with their son. Based on just all the information you've gathered over the 6 years, what would be your, maybe not advice, but how can, is there a way for them to sort of navigate this issue better than it's been in the past?
I think they should watch my film before they make a decision.
That's a good point. Cool. Well, I'll open up to you if there's anything you'd like to add, and thank you for your time either way. But yeah, if there's anything you'd like to add, that covers really everything.
Great.
I have.
Well, thank you, and let me know if there's something written later.
Great. I look forward to watching the movie.
Enjoy. Thank you again. All right.